Jacob, who disappeared when he was only 11 years old, leaving their small town in Minnesota shell-shocked and the rest of the country horrified.
This was one more day of agony for St. Joseph, Minnesota, population 3,200.
Night of October 22nd, 1989, right here. Tell me what happened.
Jacob and his brother Trevor and his friend Aaron, they didn't have school the next day and they just wanted something to do.
I got home from a hockey practice, I think, and then I wanted to rent a movie. We called my mom and asked, and she said that it would be okay. And then about halfway back, a guy came out of the ditch, and then he said that he had a gun, and then we saw it, and he told us to lay in the ditch.
It was dark, but they saw the gun, and the man told them he'd shoot. So
this was the area right about here.
They were lying in the ditches over here. They threw their bikes down.
And then he told me to run off into the woods as fast as I could, or else he'd shoot. He told Aaron to do the same thing, and then we ran, and then we cut across the field and came here, and then called 911.
At 9:32 p.m., two boys burst through the Wetterling door without Jacob. One was his brother, one was his best friend. Minutes earlier, 3 children had been riding home from Tom Thumb with a movie. Flashlights cutting through the dark, Jacob in his red hockey jacket. Then a man stepped out near a gravel driveway, raised a gun, and turned an ordinary Minnesota road into the place a whole state would never forget. For 27 years, that road held one question in silence. Where was Jacob, really? The answer was closer, darker, and more painful than anyone wanted to believe. At 9:32 p.m., you are inside the Wetterling home, and the first thing you hear is not an explanation. It is panic. 2 boys rush through the door, breathless, shaking, trying to speak over each other. One of them is Trevor Wetterling, only 10 years old. The other is Aaron Larson, 11, Jacob's best friend. They had left with Jacob. They had ridden out together, 3 boys, 2 bikes, 1 scooter, flashlights cutting through the dark. But now only 2 have come back. Jacob is not with them. For one impossible second, the house does not know what to do with that fact. The words are too large for the room. Someone took Jacob, a man, a gun, a mask. It sounds like something from television, not something that can happen on a quiet road outside St. Joseph, Minnesota, on a Sunday night in October. Just minutes earlier, everything had been ordinary. It is October 22nd, 1989. The air is dark and cool over the fields. St. Joseph is the kind of place where children still ride their bikes without adults following behind them, where a short trip to the local Tom Thumb convenience store feels less like a risk and more like a small piece of childhood. The store is about a mile away, close enough to feel safe, familiar enough to feel harmless. Jacob Wetterling is 11 years old. His younger brother Trevor is 10. Their friend Aaron Larson is 11. They want to rent a movie, nothing more. Just a movie from Tom Thumb, a simple ride there and back, the kind of thing children in small towns do, because the world has not yet taught them to be afraid of every shadow. Jacob wears his red hockey jacket. He has reflective gear. The boys have flashlights. They know the road. They know the way home. They make it to the store. They rent the movie. Then they start back. You have to picture them on that road. The beams of their flashlights move over the pavement, over the gravel, over the edge of the ditch. The night is deep around them, but they are together. They are close to home. Maybe they are talking about the movie. Maybe they are laughing. Maybe Jacob is thinking about getting back before anyone worries. Then, near a long gravel driveway, the darkness steps forward. A man appears in the road. He is dressed in black, his face is covered. In his hand, he has a gun. The boys stop. The man orders them off their bikes. He tells them to put the bikes in the ditch. Then he makes them lie down, face down, on the ground. Their flashlights are no longer tools for finding the way home. Now they are useless objects beside them, swallowed by the dark. The man asks their ages. Trevor says he is 10. Aaron says he is 11. Jacob says he is 11. Then the man tells Trevor to get up and run into the woods. Do not look back. Trevor runs because he is a child and because the man has a gun. Then the man turns to Aaron. and gives him the same order. Run. Do not look back. Aaron runs. But fear does not always obey instructions. After he gets far enough away, he looks back. The road is empty. The man is gone. Jacob is gone.
We were just talking and everything, and then this guy just came out and he had a gun, and I thought it was some kid pulling a prank on us or something, and then
What's this man look like?
well, he was all in black. He had a mask on, and
You couldn't see his face?
he had a nylon mask or some kind of mask.
Did Jacob say anything to the man?
Just his age.
When you ran, did you look back?
Yeah, once we got way down there.
What did you see?
Nothing. No, he wasn't there anymore.
Only the dark remains back at the Wetterling home. The two boys try to explain what no one wants to understand. The adults are not there, so a neighbor, Merlin Jerzak, is called. The 911. Some of their boys went down to Tom Thumb to pick up a movie. Merlin tells the dispatcher, and on their way back, someone stopped them. The dispatcher asks, was there a vehicle there, or was he walking? Merlin answers with the little information the boys have been able to give him. They didn't see a vehicle, he says. He had a mask on. That is how the search begins. Not with a name, not with a clear face, not with a car anyone can describe with certainty. Just a mask, a gun, a dark road, and two children who came home without the third. Soon, flashlights sweep the fields. Officers move toward the gravel driveway. Searchers look into the ditches and along the road. They find the things the boys left behind: the bikes, the scooter, the marks in the gravel, the signs that 3 children had been there only moments before. But Jacob is not there. A few minutes earlier, it was just a trip to rent a movie. Now, 2 bikes and 1 scooter lie in the ditch, and Jacob Wetterling has disappeared into the Minnesota night. Before Jacob Wetterling became a name on posters, before his face appeared in windows, newspapers, broadcasts, and milk cartons, he was simply a boy, riding home through the dark with his brother and his best friend. That is the first thing you have to hold on to. Jacob was not a symbol yet. He was not a case. He was not a question that would haunt Minnesota for nearly 3 decades. He was 11 years old, the first child of Jerry and Patty Wetterling, the oldest of 4 children in a house filled with movement, noise, and love. There was Jacob, then Trevor, then Amy, then Carmen. A family of 6 built around school days, sports, dinner tables, sibling arguments, and the ordinary chaos that makes a home feel alive. Jacob loved sports. He loved music. He loved animals. He loved science, especially astronomy, the kind of subject that makes a child look upward and imagine that the world is larger, brighter, and more full of wonder than adults remember. He was active, curious, funny, and kind. The kind of boy who belonged to his family, to his friends, and to the small-town roads he had ridden so many times before. And that is what makes the road so important. The road where Jacob disappeared was not supposed to be a dangerous place. It was not a back alley in a strange city. It was not a location his parents had warned him never to go. It was part of the landscape of St. Joseph, Minnesota, a small rural community where children still moved through the world with a kind of freedom that now feels almost impossible to imagine. In 1989, in towns like that, childhood still had room to roam. Kids rode bikes to stores. They cut through familiar streets. They visited friends. They went out for snacks, movies, ice cream, and small adventures that lasted only a few minutes but felt enormous when you were 11. Parents worried, of course, but not in the way they would later worry. Not with the same tightness in the chest. Not with the same need to see every step, track every route, control every distance. Tom Thumb was part of that world. To the Wetterling boys, it was not a threat. It was a convenience store, a place to rent a movie, and maybe pick up something sweet. It was close enough to feel safe, familiar enough to feel routine. The trip that night was not strange. It was not reckless. It was the kind of request children made because they believed home would still be there when they returned. Jacob wore his red hockey jacket. The boys carried flashlights. They had reflective gear. They had made a plan. They were doing what children had been told to do. Be careful, be visible, stay together, come back soon. And still, the darkness on that road changed everything. Later, when reporters tried to understand what happened, they brought people back to that stretch of road. They asked the question as plainly as they could.
You're all riding your bike and your scooter from
Yep.
this way, and you get to this area, what happens?
All of a sudden, a man came out from this area over here. He said, "Stop, I have a gun," and told us to turn off our flashlights.
That was the moment childhood cracked open. A flashlight, something meant to help a child find his way home, was turned off by command. A road everyone thought they knew became unfamiliar. A short ride became the dividing line between before and after. After Jacob, Minnesota changed. Parents who once let children ride freely began watching the end of the driveway. Porch lights took on a different meaning. A child being 5 minutes late no longer felt like a small delay. It felt like a warning. The face on the missing posters was not just Jacob's face. It became the face of every child who had ever been allowed to ride ahead. Every child who had ever promised to be right back. Every child who had ever promised to be right back. Every child whose parents believed the town itself would help keep them safe. That belief did not vanish all at once. It broke slowly, house by house, as people realized that what happened to Jacob had happened in a place that looked like theirs. A quiet road, a familiar store, a child in a red jacket, and 2 boys who came home without the third. But in those first hours as Minnesota began searching for Jacob, the most important clues may not have been miles away at all. They may have been waiting right beside the road where he vanished. The first officers arrived fast. That part matters. In the first hours after Jacob Wetterling disappeared, this was not a case that sat unnoticed. It did not begin with silence from law enforcement or a family begging someone to care. The alarm went out quickly. Officers moved toward the road. Searchers came into the dark. Flashlights cut across the fields, the ditch, the gravel driveway, and the open rural land around St. Joseph. But speed is not the same as control, and activity is not the same as progress. The scene was already difficult. It was late October in rural Minnesota. The road was dark. There was no clear view of the man's face. Trevor and Aaron had seen a figure dressed in black, covered, armed, and commanding. They had seen enough to know Jacob was taken, but not enough to give investigators the kind of clean description that solves a case in one night. Near the gravel driveway, officers found what looked like the best evidence they had: tire tracks, shoe prints, Jacob's bike, Trevor's bike, and Aaron's scooter in the ditch. These were the last physical signs of 3 boys on that road together. Everything else was darkness and memory. Right beside that scene was the Rassier farm. Dan Rassier lived near the place where Jacob vanished. That night, he was home. He later said he saw a small car come into the driveway, turn around, and leave quickly. Earlier that same day, he had also noticed another vehicle behaving strangely near the property. To him, the movement felt odd, but at first, it did not mean what it would later seem to mean. Later that night, Dan looked outside and saw flashlights moving across his family's land. He thought strangers might be on the property. Maybe someone was stealing wood. So he called 911. That call should have become part of the record. It should have been preserved, replayed, studied, and compared against the timeline. But later, the recording was not retained. One more gap opened inside a case that would eventually be full of them. By then, the search had grown. Helicopters scanned from above. Local officers searched on the ground. The FBI became involved. Volunteers joined in. Roads, fields, ditches, farms, and wooded areas were checked. People wanted to help because everyone understood the urgency. An 11-year-old boy had been taken from a road near home, and every minute mattered. But around 3 in the morning, the search was called off because the darkness made the terrain too difficult. It resumed the next morning. That pause would sit uneasily in the story for years. Could Jacob have been found if the search had continued? Would evidence have been protected better in daylight? Were people near the scene interviewed quickly enough? These questions do not have simple answers, but they matter because in cases like this, the first hours are not just important. They are often everything. And then the case exploded. The story spread beyond St. Joseph, then beyond Minnesota, then across the country. Tips began pouring in by the thousands, then the tens of thousands. Some came from people who genuinely thought they had seen Jacob. Some came from people who believed they had noticed a suspicious car, a strange man, a child in another state, a detail that sounded important. Each tip had to be logged, sorted, checked, and followed. The search became massive, but massive did not mean focused. As national attention grew, so did the pressure. Investigators were buried under sightings, theories, names, vehicles, sketches, and reports from far outside the original road. The case became so large so quickly that the center of it risked being lost. The gravel driveway, the people living nearby, the vehicle movements that night, the earlier incidents around St. Joseph, and anyone who had approached children in the surrounding towns before Jacob disappeared. Years later, Patty Wetterling would be asked a painful question.
Losing faith in law enforcement at this point.
I was frustrated. I wanted the team back. Fresh look.
That sentence says so much, because the Wetterlings were not asking for noise. They were asking for direction. They were not asking for thousands of leads to exist somewhere in boxes and files. They were asking for the right lead to be seen clearly. If this case is already sitting with you, take a second to subscribe. Stories like Jacob's are not just about what happened. They are about what was missed, what was misunderstood, and why certain names should never fade into a cold file. In those first hours, Minnesota searched for Jacob with everything it had. But while the whole state was looking outward, one of the most important clues may have already existed 9 months earlier in the story of another boy named Jared. Nine months before Jacob Wetterling vanished from that dark road in St. Joseph, another 12-year-old boy had already seen the pattern. His name was Jared Shire. He lived in Cold Spring, Minnesota, only about 10 miles from where Jacob would later be taken. He was 12 years old, walking home at night, moving through a town that felt familiar enough to trust. Just another boy on another road in central Minnesota, under the same kind of darkness, in the same kind of community where people still wanted to believe children could make it home safely. Then someone came up behind him. Years later, Jared would sit in front of a camera and describe it in words that still feel unfinished, because there are some memories no adult voice can fully repair.
Guy stepped out of the vehicle, approached me from behind, said, "I have a gun, I'm not afraid to use it."
The man who had a police scanner in his car drove Jared to this remote site, sexually assaulted him, then let him go.
I was dropped off and told to run, don't look back or he would shoot.
Run. Do not look back. Do not look back. Those words matter. Because 9 months later, on October 22nd, 1989, Trevor Wetterling and Aaron Larson would hear almost the same command on another dark road. A man with a gun, a covered face, boys heading home, a low, rough voice, a threat, a command to run, a warning not to look back. And then Jacob was gone. Jared was not just another case. He was not a side note in Jacob's story. He was the warning that came before it. Look at the similarities. Both boys were close in age. Both were approached at night. Both were on their way home. Both were in small Minnesota communities that did not think of themselves as dangerous places. In both cases, the man used fear, control, and the same kind of command language. He did not need many words. He used only enough to make a child obey. That is what makes Jared's story so important. It was not random noise in a large investigation. It was a pattern. But patterns are only useful when someone is willing to see them. After what happened, Jared was questioned again and again. He was asked to remember the man, the car, the voice, the details, the order of events, every piece his mind could hold. Investigators wanted answers. Jared wanted answers too. But he was 12. He had survived something no child should be forced to explain over and over again. He later said the questioning wore him down, mentally, physically. He did not have the answer they wanted, and the pressure became too much. Eventually, his family made the decision to leave Cold Spring. They moved away from the town, away from the roads, away from the place where a single night had changed the shape of his childhood. For years, Jared had no name for the man who took him. For years, Jacob's family had no answer either. And that is the haunting part. 2 cases sat in the same region. Close in time, close in method, close in fear. 1 boy survived. 1 boy did not come home. Yet the connection did not become the center of the investigation in the way it should have. If Jared's case had been treated as a central key from the beginning, the road ahead may have looked different. Maybe the same names would have been examined harder. Maybe the same towns would have been mapped more carefully. Maybe the same man would not have slipped back into the background for so long. But the truth waited. It waited in memory. It waited in old reports, and most importantly, it waited in evidence preserved from Jared's case. Decades later, that evidence would carry a DNA profile. And that profile would become the legal doorway back to a man investigators had once questioned and then let drift away from the center of the file. Danny Heinrich. That is why Jared matters. Not because he was close to Jacob's story, because he was part of it. And when Jared finally chose to speak publicly, he was not only speaking for himself. He was speaking for Jacob. He was speaking for other boys whose stories had been scattered across old files in small-town newspapers. He was saying that what happened to him was not isolated. It belonged to something larger. But Jared was not the only one. Old newspaper articles from Painesville would soon reveal a whole chain of forgotten incidents, a pattern almost no one in Jacob's investigation had truly put together. In 2010, 21 years after Jacob Wetterling vanished, a Minnesota mother named Joy Baker started a blog. At first, it was not supposed to become an investigation. Joy was not trying to be famous. She was not trying to become part of one of Minnesota's most painful stories. She was a mother, a writer, and someone who had grown up under the shadow of Jacob's name, like so many others in the state. Everyone in Minnesota knew Jacob. They knew the red jacket. They knew the posters. They knew the white ribbons. They knew the ache of a boy who had left for a movie and never come home. But knowing the story was not the same as understanding it. And Joy could not stop wondering whether the answer had been missed somewhere in the old details. So she drove to St. Joseph. She went to the place where Jacob disappeared. She stood near the road. She looked at the fields, the driveway, the distances, the darkness that would have covered everything that night. And something about that place stayed with her, not as a theory, not yet, more like a question that would not leave. Joy later explained it plainly.
I did want to figure out how to start my Act 2. I wanted to be a writer. So that's all I was trying to do, and I had written about another story first.
But the more she wrote, the more she read. The more she read, and the more she read, the more the case began to look different. Joy studied the weather from the night Jacob vanished. She looked into the moon phase, trying to understand how dark the road truly was. She measured distances between Tom Thumb, the Wetterling home, the gravel driveway, Cold Spring, Painesville, and the surrounding towns. She searched old newspapers, public records, police timelines, maps, interviews, and forgotten articles. She built timelines minute by minute, not because anyone had hired her, but because the official story still had too many empty spaces. Then, she met Dan Rassier. Dan lived beside the place where Jacob was taken. For years, law enforcement had looked at him with suspicion. But when Joy listened to his story, she began to see something troubling. Dan sounded less like the answer, and more like a man trapped inside a theory that investigators had kept returning to because they had no better one. That realization changed the direction of Joy's work. If Dan was not the key, then what had everyone missed? The answer began to appear through Jared Shirel. Jared was the boy from Cold Spring who had survived a terrifying encounter 9 months before Jacob vanished. His story carried details that were impossible to ignore. A boy walking home at night, a man with a weapon, a low, rough voice, a command to run, and the warning not to look back. Jared had lived with those memories for decades. But when Joy reached out, he did not just tell her what happened to him. He asked a larger question. Were there others? That question opened the door. Joy searched deeper into old, local newspapers and found an article from the Painesville Press in 1987. It described a series of incidents involving young boys in the Painesville area. The details felt disturbingly familiar. Nighttime. Boys heading home. A man who seemed to know how to use darkness, fear, and surprise. A pattern that looked too close to Jared's case, and too close to Jared's case, to be coincidence. Joy and Jared began calling it the Painesville cluster, and then they did what the official investigation had not done with enough force. They started connecting the people behind the old reports. Jared reached out as someone who understood. Joy listened, documented, mapped, and compared. One by one, old stories began to form a larger shape. This was not random. This was a pattern. But patterns do not solve themselves. Someone has to gather the pieces. Someone has to ask why one small town incident stayed separate from another. Someone has to care enough to read the old clippings. No one else is reading anymore. At first, Patty Wetterling was careful. She had protected Jacob's story for more than 2 decades. She had seen strangers attach themselves to the case. She had heard theories, rumors, and promises. So when Joy began writing publicly about Jacob, Patty was not immediately comfortable. "This is starting to feel a little stalker-ish," Patty told her. Joy was horrified. She had never wanted to cross a line. She was not trying to take the story away from Jacob's family. She was trying to help find the part of the story that had been lost. Eventually, Patty saw that. Joy was not chasing attention. Jared was not reopening his past for himself alone. Together, they were doing something quieter and more important. A mother was helping another mother. A surviving boy was helping boys who had never been fully heard. A blogger was turning scattered fragments into a map. Joy did not solve the case alone. That matters. The key legal break would come from evidence in Jared's case. But Joy and Jared helped force the old pattern back into view. They brought pressure. They brought attention. They brought the case back toward the road it should have followed years earlier. And when that pattern was finally placed on the map, an old name began to rise again. A name investigators had already known from the beginning. Danny Heinrich did not appear out of nowhere in 2016. That is the part of this case that still feels impossible to accept. For years, the public heard Jacob Wetterling's name as a mystery, as if the man who took him had vanished completely into the dark. But inside the files, inside the first months of the investigation, Heinrich's name had already been there. He lived in Painesville, and Painesville mattered. It mattered because Jared's case pointed there. It mattered because the old reports Joy Baker later found pointed there. It mattered because several boys from that area had described frightening encounters with a man who seemed to know how to use darkness, distance, and fear. Once those stories were placed beside Jacob's, the shape was hard to ignore. In 1989, Heinrich fit too many details to be dismissed easily. He was a young adult male at the time. Short, stocky, known to wear camouflage-style clothing. Connected to the Painesville area, he had access to vehicles that raised questions in relation to Jared's memory. He owned police scanners, the kind of device that could allow a person to listen for law enforcement movement in real time. None of that was proof. But it was enough to look closer, and investigators did. In early 1990, Heinrich was questioned. He was brought into the investigation not decades later, but months after Jacob disappeared. Samples were taken for comparison. His shoes were collected, his vehicles were examined. Jared was placed inside a car Heinrich had once owned, and Jared said it felt very close to the vehicle from his own memory. Not perfect, not exact, but close enough that the moment should have stayed heavy in the file. There were other pieces too. Shoe impressions, tire marks, fibers, details that kept coming back as consistent. That word would become one of the most frustrating words in the entire investigation. Consistent does not mean enough. Consistent does not mean a courtroom will accept it. Consistent does not mean a prosecutor can file the charge and win. The evidence pointed, it suggested, it circled, but it did not lock. Heinrich was put in a lineup. Jared could not identify him with certainty. The vehicle details did not match cleanly enough. Some comparisons were close, but not final. There was no effective voice lineup that forced the men to repeat the exact phrases Jared remembered. Some items that should have been handled with greater care were not preserved or used in the strongest possible way. And then, slowly, Heinrich slipped away from the center. Not because he had been proven impossible, because investigators could not prove enough. That distinction matters. A person can remain deeply suspicious and still walk out of an interview. A file can contain warning signs and still fail to become a case. A name can be written down in 1990 and still wait 25 more years before science gives it weight. While Heinrich faded, the investigation moved elsewhere. For years, attention shifted toward other theories, other men, other explanations. Dan Rassier, the music teacher who lived beside the road where Jacob was taken, became one of the most painful examples. He had been a witness near the scene. Over time, suspicion hardened around him. His farm was searched. His life was shadowed. Yet nothing tied him to Jacob. All the while, the Painesville pattern sat there like a door, no one fully opened. That is the question that refuses to disappear. If Heinrich was in the file from the beginning, why did it take nearly 27 years? Why were the Painesville cases not treated as one connected map sooner? Why did a man with so many overlapping details fall out of focus while another man, with no physical evidence tying him to Jacob, stayed under suspicion for so long? The answer is not simple. The technology was not what it is now. Small departments did not share information the way they do today. Investigators were flooded with tips. The case was enormous, emotional, and public almost from the start, but those explanations do not erase the damage. In 2015, the old evidence from Jared's case was tested again. This time, the DNA pointed back to Heinrich. The name that had been in the file in 1990 returned with a force it had never had before. Investigators searched his home. They found handcuffs, police scanners, clothing, videos, and illegal material involving minors. It was enough to build pressure. It was enough to bring Heinrich back into custody, but it still did not give prosecutors a clean, direct path to charge him for Jacob. They had certainty. They did not have the case they wanted, and that is why the next step was so painful. As one official voice in a news report later put it, after almost 27 years, Danny Heinrich was willing to talk, and we had to grab the moment. In 2016, to find Jacob, his family had to accept a choice no family should ever have to face. By 2015, the investigation had finally circled back to Danny Heinrich. Not because the original case against him had suddenly become perfect. It had not. Not because every old mistake could be repaired. They could not. The reason was evidence from Jared's case. After all those years, the preserved material from the boy who survived had done what thousands of tips, sketches, interviews, searches, and theories had failed to do. It brought Heinrich back to the center. But bringing a man back to the center of a case is not the same as proving what happened to Jacob Wetterling in court. That was the painful reality prosecutors faced. They had a DNA connection to Jared. They had a renewed pattern. They had troubling items found in Heinrich's home. They had enough to pressure him through federal charges connected to illegal material involving minors. But in Jacob's case, they still lacked the direct evidence they needed. The hardest truth was this. The legal system had answers in one hand and limits in the other. Jared's case was old, too old for some charges. Jacob's case still had no body, no direct physical link strong enough to guarantee a conviction, and no clear path to force Heinrich to say where Jacob was. Investigators believed they knew, but belief, even strong belief, does not open a grave. It does not bring a child home. So prosecutors built the only door they had left, a deal. Heinrich would admit guilt to a federal charge. In exchange, he would tell the truth about Jacob. He would explain what happened that night. Most importantly, he would lead investigators to where Jacob had been hidden. It was the kind of agreement that sounds impossible until you understand what the Wetterling family had lived through. For nearly 27 years, they had searched without a final answer. They had carried hope. because hope was the only thing that allowed them to keep standing. Patty and Jerry had built a life around absence. They had raised their children, helped other families, spoken publicly, fought for safer communities, and still, every October, the same question remained. Where is Jacob? So when the deal came, the family agreed. Not because it felt fair, not because it felt complete, not because it gave them the justice they deserved. They agreed because they needed Jacob back. On August 31st, 2016, Heinrich led investigators to a rural area near Painesville. After nearly 3 decades of searching, the answer was no longer hidden in a theory, or a tip line, or a box of old reports. It was in the ground. The first discovery was not a bone. It was fabric. Red fabric. Jacob's red hockey jacket. For 27 years, that jacket had lived in Minnesota's memory. It had been on missing posters. It had been in news reports. It had been part of the image everyone carried of the 11-year-old boy who rode toward Tom Thumb and never came home. The jacket had become a symbol of hope, a symbol of searching, a symbol of the child people still wanted to believe might one day walk back through the door. And now it was the first sign that hope had reached its most painful ending. Investigators kept digging. Then they found Jacob. There are moments in a case when language becomes too small. This was one of them. The search was over, but nothing about it felt like relief. The question had been answered, but the answer broke what little hope remained. Minnesota finally knew where Jacob was. His family could finally bring him home, but no one could call it a happy ending. It was truth, and truth can be merciful and cruel at the same time. Patty later said something that explains the emotional weight of that moment better than any report ever could. For the Wetterlings, Jacob had been alive until they found him. That does not mean they did not understand the odds. It means that a parent's hope does not obey statistics. It survives in the smallest spaces, in porch lights, in annual prayers, in every call that might be the one, in every day when no proof says otherwise. And then proof came. If this story matters to you, subscribe to the channel. We tell these cases not to reopen pain for nothing, but to understand what was missed, what was learned, and why names like Jacob Wetterling should never become just another line in a cold file. In 2016, the Wetterling family did not get the choice they deserved. They got the choice that existed. A painful deal, a red jacket, a field near Painesville, and finally, after nearly 27 years, the boy Minnesota had searched for was found. But the truth did not end with the red jacket. 1 week later, Heinrich would have to stand in a courtroom and tell Minnesota what it had waited 27 years to hear. On September 6, 2016, Danny Heinrich stood inside a federal courtroom and did what Minnesota had waited nearly 27 years to hear. He told the story. Jacob's parents were there. Patty and Jerry Wetterling sat in the same room as the man who had carried the answer for almost 3 decades. For years, they had lived with uncertainty, with hope, with rumors, with tips, with silence. They had heard strangers claim sightings. They had watched anniversaries pass. They had built a life around a question no parent should ever have to ask for that long. Where is my child? Now the man who knew was finally speaking. Heinrich did not tell it like a man giving back what he had taken. He told it plainly, coldly, almost mechanically. That may be one of the hardest parts to understand. The night that shattered a family, changed a town, and haunted a state was described in court as a sequence of steps. He said he had been driving on October 22, 1989, when he saw 3 boys on the road, Jacob Wetterling, his younger brother Trevor, and their friend Aaron Larson were heading home from Tom Thumb. They had flashlights, they had bikes and a scooter. Jacob was wearing his red hockey jacket. Heinrich said he pulled into the area near the driveway and waited. That image matters. For years, investigators had studied that driveway. Tire tracks, shoe prints, questions about cars. Questions about who had been there, who had turned around, who had seen what, and when. Now Heinrich was placing himself in the dark, waiting near the very road where 3 children would pass. He put on a mask. He carried a gun. Then he stepped out. He ordered the boys down. He asked their ages. Trevor was 10. Aaron was 11. Jacob was 11. Then Heinrich made Trevor run. He made Aaron run. The 2 boys were told not to look back. The same kind of command that had echoed through other stories from central Minnesota. And then Jacob was alone with him, Heinrich said. He put Jacob into his car and drove toward the Painesville area. Somewhere inside that terrible ride, Jacob asked a question that would become one of the most haunting lines in the entire case. What did I do wrong? There is no answer to that question. Not one that makes sense. Not one that belongs in any moral universe. Jacob had done nothing wrong. He had gone to rent a movie. He had ridden home with his brother and his best friend. He had worn a red jacket and carried a flashlight and followed a road he knew. But the man beside him gave him fear instead of an answer. Near Painesville, Heinrich ended Jacob's life. The details do not need to be stretched out. They do not need to be replayed with cruelty. What matters is this: Jacob did not get to come home that night. The search that began along a dark road in St. Joseph had already become something far worse than anyone wanted to believe. Afterward, Heinrich returned home. Later, he came back and buried Jacob. For about a year, that place held the secret. Then Heinrich returned and saw that the site had partly opened. What he noticed was the red jacket, the same red hockey jacket that had become part of Jacob's image across Minnesota. The jacket on posters. The jacket people remembered when they thought of the missing boy from St. Joseph. The jacket that for years had represented the possibility that Jacob might still be found alive. Now it was visible in the soil. So Heinrich moved Jacob to another location, across the road, where he would remain hidden for more than 25 more years. That is the cruelty of the red jacket. It had once been a sign of childhood, then a sign of hope, then, finally, a sign of confirmation. When investigators found it in 2016, they knew they were no longer chasing a theory. They were standing at the end of the question. The jacket that had traveled through newspapers, broadcasts, flyers, and memory had led them back to Jacob. For the Wetterling family, the confession gave answers, but not peace in the way people sometimes imagine. It ended the waiting, but it did not undo the years. It gave them the truth, but the truth came wrapped in the final loss of hope. For nearly 27 years, Minnesota had asked where Jacob was. In court, Heinrich answered, but to understand why Jacob had to wait that long, you have to look directly at what the investigation got wrong. To understand why Jacob Wetterling had to wait nearly 27 years to be found, you cannot look at one mistake. You have to look at the chain. This case was not lost because one person failed to make one phone call, or because one clue was missed on one night. It was something larger, something slower, something more damaging. It was a series of cascading failures, each one feeding the next until the truth was pushed further and further away from the road where Jacob disappeared. The first failure was scale. The case became enormous, almost immediately. That made sense. An 11-year-old boy had been taken by a masked man with a gun. The community was terrified. The media arrived. Tips came in by the thousands, then by the tens of thousands. People reported cars, strangers, sightings, rumors, feelings, faces, and theories from across the country. Every tip had to be recorded. Every call created another task. Every new possibility pulled investigators in another direction. But a large search is not always a focused search. The road, the driveway, the nearby homes, the people who lived closest to the scene, the movements around St. Joseph that night, all of that needed careful, immediate attention. Some of it received attention. Some of it did not receive enough. In a case this urgent, the difference between those two things can last for decades. Then there was Painesville. The pattern was there. Boys in the same region, nighttime encounters, similar commands, a man who used darkness and fear. Jared Shire's case, only 9 months before Jacob, carried details that should have stayed at the center of the investigation. But the Paynesville incidents were not pulled together early enough with the force they deserved. That is one of the most painful questions in the whole case. Why did that pattern remain scattered for so long? Why did Jared and the other boys have to wait years before their stories were treated as part of something bigger? Why did it take a blogger and a surviving victim to place those pieces on a map in a way the official investigation had not? And then there was Danny Heinrich. He was not unknown. He was not invisible. He lived in Paynesville. He matched important features. He had been questioned early. His vehicle, shoes, clothing, and equipment raised questions. Some comparisons were close. Some evidence was described as consistent, but nothing locked hard enough. He was not held in the center of the case. Instead, he drifted away. Years passed. The investigation moved toward other theories, and one of the people pulled deepest into that shadow was Dan Rassier. Dan lived beside the place where Jacob was taken. At first, he was a witness. He had seen unusual vehicle movement near his driveway. He had called 911 when he saw flashlights on his property. He had cooperated with investigators. But over time, suspicion turned toward him with a weight that would change his life. For years, Dan lived under the cloud of being watched, questioned, doubted, and publicly linked to the case. In 2010, law enforcement searched the Rassier farm. Heavy equipment was brought in. Soil was removed. The property was dug through as cameras and public attention circled the scene. They found nothing that tied Dan to Jacob, but the damage did not vanish when the search ended. Suspicion has a way of staying after evidence fails to arrive. It can cost work. It can cost peace. It can cost a person the ability to live normally in the place where they have always lived. That is another question this case leaves behind. When investigators believe a theory deeply enough, do they begin to see every detail through it? And when that happens, what do they stop seeing? To be fair, the world of 1989 was not the world of today. DNA technology was limited. Information moved slowly between agencies. Small-town departments did not have the same tools, databases, or training that later generations would rely on. The pressure was immense. The media was everywhere. The number of leads was almost impossible to manage. Those facts matter, but they do not erase the failures. Later officials would acknowledge that law enforcement had failed in this case. That admission does not mean every officer was careless. It means the system did not hold the pieces together when it mattered most. It means the right patterns were not centered early enough. It means the wrong paths consumed years that could never be given back. Jacob did not come home after 27 years because technology alone saved the case. He came home because a mother refused to stop hoping, because a surviving boy found the courage to speak, and because a writer was willing to read old newspapers everyone else had left behind. Go back to the beginning. Go back to the 9:32 p.m. October 22, 1989. Two boys rush into the Wetterling home, breathless and terrified. Trevor is there. Aaron is there. But Jacob is not. Somewhere behind them is a dark rural road, a gravel driveway, two bicycles, one scooter in the last ordinary place where three children had been together. Tom Thumb was supposed to be just a store. A movie was supposed to be just a store. A red hockey jacket was supposed to be just something an 11-year-old boy wore on a cool Minnesota night. But after Jacob Wetterling disappeared, none of those things stayed ordinary. The store became part of a timeline. The road became part of a wound. The red jacket became a symbol carried by an entire state for nearly 27 years. And that is why this story cannot end with the name of the man who took him. It has to end with Jacob. Jacob was 11 years old. He was the oldest child in the Wetterling family. A big brother to Trevor, Amy, and Carmen. He was Jerry and Patty's son. He was a friend, a teammate, a boy who loved sports, music, animals, science, and astronomy. He was curious about the sky. He had a life that was bigger than the worst night of it. That matters, because when a child becomes part of a famous case, the world can slowly flatten them into one image, a poster, a date, a headline, a question. But Jacob was not a headline. He was a real child, from a real home, loved by real people who had to keep breathing after the door opened and only 2 boys came back. Patty Wetterling could have allowed grief to become only silence. Instead, she turned it into action. She spoke for Jacob. She spoke for other families. She helped build a center in his name, dedicated to protecting children and supporting families. She carried Jacob's story into schools, communities, interviews, and public conversations where people needed to understand that safety was not just a feeling. It had to be built. It had to be taught. It had to be taught. In 1994, Jacob's name became part of a major federal law, the Jacob Wetterling Act. That law changed the way America tracked and managed information about people who posed serious dangers to children. It did not bring Jacob back. No law could do that. But it meant his name would become part of a system designed to prevent other families from facing the same empty doorway. That is legacy, not the kind anyone asks for, but the kind built from love, when love refuses to stop working. If you have followed Jacob's story this far, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. And in the comments, tell us what part of this case stayed with you most. The red jacket, the road, Jared's courage, Joy Baker's research, or Patty's refusal to give up hope. These stories matter, because remembering them is one way we keep asking better questions. And Jacob's case teaches painful questions. A small pattern between old incidents can be the key everyone misses. A survivor's memory should not be treated as a footnote. An old newspaper article can hold the missing piece that a massive file failed to connect. A search does not only need more people, it needs the right questions. And a family does not only need answers, they need the truth to be respected. For nearly 27 years, Minnesota searched for Jacob in fields, roads, tips, rumors, and prayers. Porch lights stayed on. White ribbons appeared. His face remained in public memory. Patty held on to the word hope, not as blind belief, but as movement. Hope meant calling again, speaking again, reading again, asking again, standing again. Hope was not waiting. Hope was action. And in the end, one of the most painful symbols led investigators back to him: the red hockey jacket. The same jacket from the posters, the same jacket people remembered when they thought of the boy who rode toward Tom Thumb. The same jacket that had once meant childhood, then hope, then confirmation. Maybe that is why the final images are so hard to separate. A porch light in the dark, an eagle near the place Patty drives past, the word hope inside the Wetterling home. A red jacket, a rural road that no longer feels silent. Jacob Wetterling did not come home the way Minnesota prayed he would. But his name changed laws, changed families, and taught a country that hope is not waiting. Hope is refusing to stop.